Transformers Combiner Wars, not to be confused with the comic arc and the craptacular web series of the same name, was the first toy line in what would retroactively be called the Prime Wars trilogy. This line mainly consisted of figures that could be put together into a super robot of epic proportion. 4 Deluxes and 1 Voyager was all that was needed to make the Combiner in question, and it was a massive homage to the Scramble City style of toys released during Generation 1, with a surprise 6-member team. This was the perfect way to get most of the Autobot and Decepticon sub-teams, as it also consisted of characters that weren't originally part of a Combiner like Optimus, Prowl, and Hound, for example. It also, for some reason or another, replaced already established members for some new blood and gave them the exclusive treatment. I can only imagine how that would play out in 2020. I personally have a massive appreciation for this line, however I could definitely see where the complaints lie, as the articulation and posability was super toned down for the sake of the combining gimmick. Yes, even in a pre-War for Cybertron trilogy world. The Legends class didn't make the best weapons, but who were buying them for those purposes? Also, if you were wondering about the Leader class, they were doing their own thing. And most egregious of all the deluxe conversions tended to blend in with each other. Not only for being brain dead simple, but if your figure had a potential part that could be reused, it was going to be reused for others even if it was overdone or made no sense. Even with such red flags, the line doesn't bother me, as it was my first Transformers line when I was getting into the franchise. I always appreciate a simple transformation that isn't a one-step changer. And most importantly, in an age where every figure is required to be the best interpretation of the character in question, I'm beginning to realize the Prime Wars trilogy as a whole was the last toyetic Transformers line. For example, I know Legacy Menasor is a super accurate and chunky boy with separate bots with unique conversions and body types, for the most part. However, because of Motormaster's complexity, I don't combine them unless I need them to be Menasor. Combiner Wars Bruticus, by the time I'm done with the next paragraph, I combined and disassembled them 3 times. Truth be told, I don't like the Combiner skeleton, especially since it makes everyone who is a Menasor look fat in a way the Prime Wars pegs and ports don't. Both styles has its pros and cons, and if you prefer how Combiner characters are handled nowadays, this part of the intro was not made to demean you in any way, shape, or form. It's just that this line and certain figures have been verbally abused for a very long time, even though it should be represented as the last of a bygone era where deluxes were even more affordable than 2022, and G1 fatigue wasn't a feeling anyone was allowed to have unless they wanted their ears torn off by a bunch of millennials. Now living in a post-legacy world where everyone and anyone can get their own figure, I can gladly say as a Gen Zer, G1 is always going to be the top priority when it comes to Hasbro, and doing this will always be more satisfying than this. So join me for every other week in summer as I revisit the toy line controversial yet so exhilarating. Starting with the figures that use this method of transformation I'm dubbing the Strut-like figures. The deluxe play mold, being a recipient of Combiner Wars' inaugural wave, was bound to be reused for a lot of flight-based Cybertronians. I personally own all the Superion limbs, Dreadwind, and Blackwing, so all my opinions will revolve around them. Every other version of this mold looks awesome, and I wish I had them, especially Hellbat and Skyhawk. Because of the template forced upon the designers, the mold does an okay job at replicating who it wants to be while also sculpting them in ways that elevate or completely changes their vibe for the better, in my opinion. Skydive feeling like a character voiced by Dan Green, I can now tell Firefly and Air Raid apart as the former entered his mysterious masked mercenary era, but not really. And despite being forced into combiner limbs, Hydra and Buster still had components so they can merge into their superjet, which isn't the best at holding together, so 3D printed upgrades it is. Posing for this mold is the textbook definition of basic, meaning 20 steps above G1, 20 steps below the unification stuff. A passable in between that could also apply to the transformation, where the splitting legs meet their peak as everything sandwiches with the back in a divine sense of wonder. Wings and arms, depending on the figure, can vary from slightly complex to baby's first final steps. The jets they result in are nifty yet super cartoony on top, featuring a robot doing the yoga, which, believe it or not, is seen as normal in this fandom. We just give it the thumbs up while trashing it when it's not paying attention. Like Night Scream! Some have posable wings, some are static, while others fall apart if you even think about moving them the wrong way. As combiner legs, they look decent enough, featuring configurations that can make them look more or less cohesive. However, as arms, they rock the air with the rear fins acting like blades for an extended hitbox. The Prime Wars Deluxe planes might be the poster boys for the repetitious reputation of the Prime Wars pilot and finale, but as figures, they provide an enjoyable Transformers experience that could be fun for those not greedy with jet accuracy. In the current year of 2025, the aerial bots have suitable replacements for most people. However, if I wanted to recommend a version of this mold, I'd choose Blackwing and Dreadwind. Not only for the Superjet, but just because they're just charming in their goofiness. If the Prime Wars jet was the most over-reused mold during the past decade, then the Combiner Wars helicopters aren't letting them keep that crown without a fight, as unlike the jets, the Choppas went to the Starscream school of character design because they're all the exact same dude with different colors and maybe a different head. Have they cemented their fate? Well, for starters, Vortex 64 may feel and look like a dark copy of Street Bravo Alpha. However, instead of whittling his opponent's health down to 0 with his machine gun, he prefers to use his missile fists to punch Autobots so hard they fly off the stage. Blades, in comparison, captures and mixes his cartoon head with the colors of the original toy while not changing the missile hand so he can blow up any debris-filled roads while First Aid rushes the president to the hospital. At first, you may feel like the helicopter bots are the same as the plane bots in terms of articulation. That's because they are. However, because the vehicle mode is slim in nature, they feel more athletic, with the only burden being their rotor-shaped backpacks, because even for 2015 standards, this was unacceptable. Would have definitely benefited from parts forming, effectively making a sword or something. Other than twiddling the feet and the kibble around it to make the cockpit, the conversion is literally the play mold, but backwards. While the Rescue Chopper aesthetic doesn't fit Vortex's whacked out personality at all, Blades fits it like a glove, especially with those tampographics and spinning blades that lift them to better places as they surpass the jet mold as limbs. Leg mode doesn't require much to make them look passable and creating a knee that makes the movie Ninja Falcon Megazord blush. Arm mode, on the other hand, yeah, I hope you aren't a fan of the High Moon games, cause configuring it to do this is gonna make you hate Activision more than most rightfully do. It absolutely stumbles in a few areas it shouldn't have in the first place. But if you're willing to look past those, the Combiner Wars helicopters aren't anything to write home about, yet wonderful brothers in arms at the same time. Vortex 64 is fine on his own, but what if you wanted to give him a new flow? Unfortunately, I'm strapped for cash in time, so that'll have to wait. And it's been so long since the original version of that shore, I still haven't done anything new with it. Yeah, see you tomorrow. And it's been a little bit of time since the re-upload, I still haven't done anything with it. Got your ass again! So out of all the Protectobots, First Aid is the most well known thanks to his episode in Season 3 being one of its best. Unfortunately, his figure isn't up to snuff in major ways. One of those ways isn't the look, cause the head is a dead ringer for this dweeby pacifist while giving him an action hero physique that'll make his G1 counterpart blush. Sure, the paint is a little messy and the Autobot symbol is a terrible impression of the Decepticon logo, but that's only because the jig is up, all my Protectobots are knockoffs. So as far as I'm concerned, and comparing them to versions of characters using their molds, they're just as good as their official counterparts. First Aid being one of the exceptions, cause a lot of his problems can be antiquated to any of the characters using this mold. How many problems? Problem 1. I don't like how skinny his forearms are. Sure, they match with his soft boy aura, but they look more flimsy than the ankles, which refuse to stay connected even with the amount of surgery you have to do to the knockoff if the joints are too tight. And on that note, problem 2, the conversion is easily the worst iteration of the strut legs thanks to, again, these flimsy ass ankles that I'm convinced are calling me a slur whenever I do anything with them, and the stupidly specific positioning of the forearms. The resulting SUV feels like 50 Shades of Prime Ratchet, and that's not a problem unless you're asking for it to roll, which the knockoff can't do. The leg mode is just the van rotated vertically with the front of it becoming a knee, which definitely feels like it's gonna snap one day. And problem 3, the arm mode, the one mode we keep this boy in even if we are engaging with the Scramble City gimmick thanks to the best episode of Season 3, is an abomination that validates the leaders of the Combiner Skeleton cult because why oh why didn't you fill this stupid gap in? And before someone in the back starts blaming the bootleggers, here's some pics of the official being mutilated to see how much better that would look. Not to mention how it would hold these stupid ankles in place, inspiring me not to use his axe to play unlicensed doctor on this turd! Yeah, I don't think I like the Van mold, or at least my copy of First Aid. He hasn't broken in a serious area yet, but when you have to extensively loosen joints, the legs are in the final stage of cancer, and other knockoffs are genuinely better than you. Yeah, nah, splurge on the original if you need it. Get your not a fighter ass off the battlefield and come back when we need you to be a stupid leg. There's no shortage of bike characters in the Unification era. However, back in the Prime Wars days, for some unexplained reason to my knowledge, a Legend-sized figure was always ready for retail while their deluxe counterparts were always an exclusive. Afterburner was in a gift set, Wreck-Gar got shafted to Walgreens, and Groove, who was a notable Combiner team member, was originally replaced for the better in most people's eyes. But seeing how I don't have Rook or any of the Legend cycles, that just means the deluxe bike molds are monoliths to behold, right? Well, not exactly. Starting with the transformation this time because posability is nothing new if you've been paying attention to the last 3 figures. And in terms of looks, this mold definitely replaces my comprehension of Groove simply for looking 1000% better than the cartoon model. Can't speak for either version of Afterburner, and let's be real, you're not buying this mold for Wreck-Gar in 2026 unless you really don't want the 86 figure for some reason. But what about the OG generation's Wreck-Gar? I can't comfortably transform that thing without this badass looking upgrade kit that cost me an $80 misfire, breaking or falling apart, so custody for the Pinwheel Sword goes to the CW cause Hasbro repacked it with him. Groove comes with these 2 guns that are different colors for some reason. So after configuring the legs, backpack, and arms, getting these 2 halves of the back wheels together is a fiddly endeavor. The orientation to put them together is simple to remember, however they still insist on putting you through a last man standing match before fully going together. Once it is fully together, the vehicle mode actually feels and looks like a realistic, except for the size, motorcycle which can be ridden on. Sure, it's not going to eat the Leg RC's cake anytime soon, but it still cooks, especially since the knockoff styles on the bootleg van mold. Also, it's super funny that the knockoff has the better connection to the back wheel than the official figure. As a combiner arm, it has 2 configurations, one with the front wheel on top, the other with it on its side. Either way looks fine, and it doesn't hinder the wrist-mounted saw blade that can absolutely ruin another combiner's line of sight when clotheslined. Leg mode causes whatever torso bot to fall over and crush it, fatally murdering whatever Cybertronian is unfortunate enough to take part of the Combiner Wars because it's way too small to be a leg. Is what I would say if this wasn't the land of make-believe, because of course it grows twice its size, and it's genuinely better if you mistransform this part, because at the end of it all, the Prime Wars Deluxe motorcycles weren't as bad as the opening paragraph made them out to be. They're just hyper-specific in one inconsequential yet important area. However, when there are Transformers with worse hyper-specific instructions, I'll certainly give a slacker their flowers. Also, wrist-mounted saw blade. Need I say more? Before we get to our final 2 figures of the day, allow me to somewhat quickly explain what is Power of the Primes. Not to be confused with the recent as of 2025 toy line Age of the Primes, and the craptacular web series of the same name, was the final set of figures released in late 2017 and lasted around the final months of 2018 for the Prime Wars trilogy. Okay, so this line was kind of about using Prime Masters to quote-unquote power up your figures and featured leader figures that were past versions of characters who could become their upgraded forms. But in reality, it was given the reputation of Combiner Wars 2 Lost in New York, and for this trilogy's worst qualities imploding on top of each other. $5 minifigures that didn't do much in shell form to hell and back, gimmicks with abysmal execution, remolds galore, and jazz. Nothing specific, just jazz, which is sad to say. Like Combiner Wars, I have a small appreciation for this line because the Terracons rocked and it had affordable versions of characters I saw at 6 AM before school on the hub, not that one. However, I will agree with the majority and say that this is a flawed line that should have gotten rid of the Pretenders because of its ridiculous non-existent gimmick and just focus on making actual figures of the 13 Primes. Oh wait, they're doing that now. Age of the Primes is really just Power of the Primes calling a do-over. And from what I've seen, the Primes are excellent in their own right as figures. Still own none of them currently, but from initial reveals, it was safe to say there was nowhere better to go but up. The Skeleton Combiner can still take a hike though. Other than that, I have nothing else to say about this line, so, the legends keep the same quality as Titan's Return, and I wish somebody would downscale Predaking already, and, Rippersnapper and Blot. As robots, they look like late season 3 characters, aka generic as hell. However, their expressions have been given hyper mean and ugly detail that won't hesitate to take your lunch money even though you brought last night's leftovers. In fact, if Blob was given rotating wrist and ankle pivots, these two would have been close to being given Unification era articulation. It's debatable if we would have gotten Unification era conversions because the Combiner boards are still here, therefore still sharing the strut legs from every other figure so far. However, what makes them diverse is, oddly enough, pulling down their monster legs and making the littlest of changes to the hands, creating abominations that'll feast upon your worst nightmares and replace them with a fourth Trump presidency. The fuck you mean for? We got a walking RoboShark with dual lasers and Razor Shark teeth that chomp on the living flesh before it's devoured by its normal robot head, and okay, John Warden says he's an ogre, but I've always interpreted Blot as an offspring of a hunchback and a pit bull. Either way, he has big meaty claws, a short temper, and no mouth movement. Seriously, the Prime Legion figure had a goblin mode that was more cohesive, but made an okay leg and a non-existent arm. So on that note, both of them as combiner limbs are fine. The monster heads are maneuvered in ways that make them cohesive, so there's nothing really to complain about. I guess if you were missing a combiner head and was super desperate, you could make Rippersnapper into a knife hand. It's limp and not beating the bike mode's wrist saw. While Rippersnapper and Brock don't bring anything new to the Prime Wars style of combining, they easily destroy their competition by having the most ridiculous yet fascinating beast modes I've ever seen, even tossing most of Kingdom's roster in the dangerous waters. If you come across them at a convention or on eBay, they are an absolute solid recommendation. I'd usually have a conclusion by this point, but considering I have more figures to yap about, I'll just leave it pause here before this production becomes an every Prime figure situation. So if you have any of the Prime Wars Combiner figures that have strut legs, share about what you got in the comments below. And if you're new here and enjoyed what you saw, then feel free to like and subscribe. It shows this website that I'm making stuff people actually want to see, and you wouldn't want to miss out on my honest-to-God opinions. Like how great it is to finally not have these files collect digital dust for 2 years. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, may whatever time or place treat you well.